Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I've got you for 10 minutes this morning, so I'll hand over to you.
I always like to submit on election laws, and of course, this is one. And so, I think one of the things I should possibly say is the thing that you will have many submitters, and perhaps few will have focused on that. And so I will start with that. I think it is not important that the referendum requirements be passed before you pass or look to further progress this bill, but I think the legislation providing for what any referendums would look like, and indeed this may not be the only one you have this term of Parliament, with the term of Parliament being another referendum that might come up, that bill should at least, I think, be introduced before final decisions are made, before perhaps you get to a second reading on this bill, so that when you're discussing, should this bill be passed, you know what the end result of having it passed would look like, and that might affect, how you draft, for example, if you're going to redraft the proposed principles in here. Because one of the other things I suggest is that, my particular concern with this bill is, and there are at least a couple of principles in it which I strongly support. In particular, I would say equal protection of the laws. So as a distinct from equality, equal protection of the laws is important, and it is something that could have more explicit recognition in New Zealand law. There have been sort of recent things in the US with the 14th Amendment. It's generally agreed that that section of the US Constitution is its most important because of the way it protects everyone. And if there is a concern that equal protection isn't fully recognised in New Zealand law, writing that and putting it somewhere, could be the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act or the Constitution Act or the Senior Courts Act or half a dozen other places, even a formal written constitution or something like that. Those sorts of things are appropriate. At the moment, I look at this and that's not really a treaty principle, is I think my concern with this. And if there are people who have concerns with what the treaty principles are, or have concerns that other aspects of the law, respect for property rights or whatever it is like that, those are things that I think are addressed elsewhere. And you have the particular problem with the treaty principles section of, if you're defining these as treaty principles, and the Act is saying, and use these treaty principles when interpreting laws which say have respect for treaty principles. Well, equality before the law, equal protection, the other principles that we describe here, I would have said, if they're important all the time. Not the sort of the 20 or 30 bits of law which have a treaty principle section. It's important when you're looking at all of the legislation and all of the decisions government and local government makes when there isn't a treaty principle involved at all. And so someone charged with under the Criminal Procedure Act or something like that. You very much want equal protection of the laws for people facing prosecution, but the Criminal Procedure Act and the Crimes Act don't have treaty principle sections, so this additional guarantee of equal protection will add nothing to protect people who are affected by the strongest imposition of state power prosecuting someone. There's a bit more in my submission. I have some suggestions of, if you are going to have something like this, and I think it is important for you to at least have a look at how these principles, if they're going to stay in this way, are introduced. Because even if this bill does not pass, and this Parliament, through this legislative process, decides we're not going to have that referendum that this legislation promises, it is distinctly possible the other election laws we have, the Citizens Initiated Referendums Act, might be used to have it. And so having some, no one, I think a lot of people who are opposed to this law do not like these principles. That will not change, and certainly not as treaty principles. But they could be introduced in a different way, so that if someone is to start that petitions process to try and get 10% of New Zealanders to force the government to hold a referendum, that, do you want it to be held with the principles introduced in the exact way they are introduced in this legislation, or could they be slightly ameliorated? So if someone is going to force a vote, it's a vote on something which might be a legal fiction, but is less of a historical fiction. I think that's probably what I've got to say. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Graeme, we do have a list of questions. The first one's from Debbie Ngārewa-Packer, then Todd, and then John.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the submission. Your whole submission, I shouldn't say the whole, but it effectively talked about the risks and the potential conflicts. And I'd be really interested in a couple of questions. How does this bill, from your perspective, create ambiguity in interpreting treaty-related legislation?
There's a couple of things, and sort of the Section 7 report, which I think you've probably looked at. We have no idea what the courts will actually do with this, and this is very much a bill aimed at the courts and telling them, when you're looking at those bits of law which have treaty principle sections, how should you apply them? And we have a sense of how that happens now. We have no sense really of how that would change. And so that's why I think if you're looking to have greater protection for property rights, you add property rights to the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. You're looking to have equal protection or equality, put that somewhere else, so that the context in which it's used is better understood by courts. Courts know how the Bill of Rights works and applies in all these sorts of contexts. And so if you have that sort of thing in Section 5 of the Bill of Rights about justified limitations on property rights or whatever, that's a process that courts are good and have experience at using. This one is trying to take something like that and put it somewhere, mostly where it doesn't belong, even if it is a really good principle. And that one in particular, equal protection, I think is. It's why you have the 14th Amendment generally thought to be the most important part of the US Constitution.
Thank you, Graeme. Todd, and then Josh.
Thanks, and thanks for your submission. It's very interesting. At least one submitter this morning actually said that Article 3 of the treaty actually only offered equal protection or equal rights to Maori. Do you think that would be, and you're actually saying equal protection should be actually a higher level, higher order protection. Yes. So do you think only providing equal protection, equal rights to one group of people based on ethnicity would be appropriate?
Part of the reason sort of that happens, the same reason we have sort of the UN Convention on the Rights of Women, the UN Convention on the Rights of Indigenous Minorities, is that every so often that doesn't happen, and someone has to say, and we mean them too. You have the important requirements or protections of equal protection, but then you look at what has happened in the world, a number of countries, Afghanistan or whatever, with the rights of women, all sorts of things. Lots of countries, including historically New Zealand and even obviously to an extent today New Zealand, putting a section like that, the reason you have that is not to say that Māori have greater equal protection, it's to just underline. When we said everyone has equal protection, we meant them too. We meant Māori too. It's the 14th Amendment. The US Constitution has no sort of provision for different treatment of races, certainly very early on. But you looked at it and lots of that was not happening. You had during the South, during the pre-civil rights era. And it's like the 14th Amendment was, and we mean former slaves too. When it was passed. And this can be very much, everyone has these rights, but sometimes you have to underline, yes, everyone has these rights, and actually that hasn't happened, so we need them to. I've said it, I think, 4 times. So.
Graeme, we've got a question from Just Moon.
Oh, hello, Graeme. Thank you for that submission. Look, this point around Principle 3.1, the everyone is equal before the law, just, I asked the question before, but I'll sort of ask it again, slightly rephrase it, but just this principle comes from the Magna Carta back in 1215, and importantly, it sought to prevent the king from exploiting his power, placing limits on royal authority by establishing laws and power in itself. So the important point that the king and his government are not above the law. When I look at Archdeacon Henry Williams' letter to Bishop Selwyn, where he said he thought this was the Magna Carta for the Aborigines of New Zealand, and I look at Article 3, which said that the Queen of England imparted to them all rights and privileges of British subjects. Would you accept that this was intending to impart that key principle of the Magna Carta to New Zealand, particularly for the Aborigines, as they framed it at the time?
Of course, the reason that Article 3 gives those rights to Māori or to New Zealanders, as it was known then, was that British subjects already had the rights of British subjects. So no reason to give them to them in a treaty that you're signing with someone else. That's about extending the rights that other people already have. And so that's, I think, particularly why, and it's possibly a better answer to the question from Mr. Stevenson earlier. It was like, why are we giving Māori those rights? Well, they didn't have them before then, but British subjects generally did. I don't know that I really think of the treaty as that sort of Magna Carta type thing, with the difficulties that a large number of iwi didn't sign it and all those sorts of things. And I think very much, but it does serve that purpose of saying, British subjects have a lot of rights. We're going to make sure that everyone else has them too.
Thank you, Graeme. Another very good submission. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thanks for having me.
It's a very interesting submission. Like, I can't tell is he for or against, but it's mentioning so many things wrong. If you go ahead.
I actually, he was trying to give a balanced nuance around the impact of what is equal rights and does it only go to Māori, does it only go to Pākehā, all of that. What people forget is that te tiriti is between Māori and the Crown. Every citizen sits under the Crown. Therefore, every citizen has equal rights under the Bill of Rights Act, the Human Rights Act, and all the different legislation. We already have in law equality legislation. The difference being that Māori and the Crown had a direct partnership agreed and guaranteed under te tiriti. We never ceded sovereignty. It was voluntary on both sides. Māori believed that the gentleman's agreement, so to speak, was going to be upheld. Why? Because the British had over 600 years of international law knowledge behind them. And international law back then and today stated that every treaty signed has to be upheld from the indigenous language within which it is written, not from the foreign language, but from the language within which Māori understood. So when we look at that, it means that the Crown are trying to retranslate the Māori version and trying to emphasize the English version, but we have to go back to the Māori version. The other thing there too, it was designed to give Māori equality with the British subjects, which is what he highlighted. We never got it. Within 10 years, we went from being the majority through disease and other methods, we became a minority. And that was filled with disease, deaths, muskets being introduced. We all know the story.
Yeah. And we seem to have had Huhana freeze.
I was going to say, I wasn't aware of that being international law to be upheld from the perspective of the Indigenous person.
Yep.
It was kind of excellent.
Law, but international law has had a long standing that it always upholds the Indigenous version ahead of the English version.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, let's see.
That's how I would do it.
Let's see how the next one called The Facts.
Thanks for watching. Make sure you're subscribed to our Facebook